Yeah, it definitely is just missing a huge part of this story. And I think that the narrative that has already emerged from this, despite the fact that I think that the headline that they wanted to write was that, like, listen, there weren't any FBI special agents undercover out in the crowd. But instead, obviously, the narrative that has been written off of this in conservative media certainly is that, like, oh my gosh, look at all these confidential human sources are out there.
It's the Lawfare podcast. I'm Molly Reynolds, Senior Fellow at Brookings and Senior Editor at Lawfare, with Quinta Jurecic, a Fellow at Brookings and a Senior Editor at Lawfare, and Ryan Reilly, Justice Reporter at NBC News.
One of the things that makes this an intelligence failure on the FBI's part is that everyone knew it was going to happen. I mean, we didn't all know that rioters were going to break into the Capitol, but we knew that something was going to happen on January 6th because everyone was posting about it and Trump had tweeted about it.
Today, we're talking about two new investigative reports on January 6th and where things stand in the effort to hold individuals accountable on the 4th anniversary of the insurrection. I want to start us off by talking about, first, the Department of Justice Inspector General's long-awaited report on January 6th. Quinta, do you want to just give us a little bit of context for this report? What is it? Why did it take so long to come out? Why does it have the scope it does? That sort of thing.
We've been waiting for this report to come out, I think it's fair to say, for 3 years at this point. It was announced, I believe, pretty shortly after January 6th that the Justice Department Inspector General, along with a range of others inspectors general across the government, would be conducting an investigation of how the department handled the run-up to the 6th and the day itself. Most, if not all, of those other Inspector General offices finished their reports, in some cases, a very long time ago. And so anyone who has seen my and Molly's Slack messages knows that at this point it is a running joke that every time the DOJ IG would drop something, we would get briefly excited and then not so excited as we realized that this still somehow was not the January 6th report. But they were kind enough to finally release it. So they came in just under the wire on the 4-year anniversary of January 6th. I was pretty surprised when this came out at how short it was. It is a pretty slim 88 pages for a report from the DOJ IG's office. And it announces right at the beginning that there is a lot that it is not going to talk about. Some of that has to do with the fact that, as I mentioned, other inspectors general got there first, which I will say the idea that you don't have to do your homework because somebody else already did theirs is a principle that I wish I could have taken advantage of in high school. But the other part that's kind of missing here is the portion on what happened in the Justice Department as opposed to the FBI. The report is really focused on how the FBI handled the run-up to January 6th, and for good reason, and we'll discuss that. But it basically states explicitly, we decided not to look at a big portion of what happened here because there was a criminal investigation and prosecution ongoing. And it seems pretty clear that that is referring to the investigation and prosecution undertaken by the Justice Department, then Special Counsel Jack Smith, in the prosecution of Donald Trump. It is a little unclear whether or not that portion of the investigation is dead, sleeping, maybe will it be revived? We don't really know. And it's not a total black box. We do have some sense of what it is that went on in the Justice Department that is not described here, because we know it from the indictment of Trump in the January 6th case, and of course the January 6th committee's work. This is, for those who paid attention, essentially the sort of subplot about Trump attempting to get the Justice Department to reach out to state legislatures, particularly in Georgia, and say that DOJ was investigating election fraud and put Jeffrey Clark in charge of the department. So that failed, but it's sort of a crucial part of the story in terms of Trump's efforts to overturn the 2020 election. And it is not in here at all. For that reason, I think this is a very odd document in that it's missing I don't know what percent of the story, 50%, 75%. And then the question of how it handles the remaining 50 to 25%, I think is a different issue on which I'm sure we also all have thoughts. But Ryan, I'm curious what you make of the eventual shape that this took.
Yeah, that was a really, really great summary. Yeah, it definitely is just missing a huge part of this story. And I think that the narrative that has already emerged from this, despite the fact that I think that the headline that they wanted to write was that, listen, there weren't any FBI special agents undercover out in the crowd, but instead, obviously, the narrative that has been written off of this in conservative media certainly is that, oh my gosh, look at all these confidential human sources are out there. Does the level of detail trickle down into those stories that only a very small portion of those individuals were actually tasked by the FBI with going here and some of them were just there? No, of course it doesn't. Is there any context about how many confidential human sources there are in the United States of America? No. Is there a context of how many thousands of people went to DC and whether, confidential human sources were overrepresented on a percentage-based level of the percentage of Americans who are confidential human sources, and then based on how many people actually went to DC, and were those numbers wildly off? Because if you think about it for a second, and you're all of these thousands and thousands of people, I don't want to mess up the number, but for some reason, 40,000 is striking to me as people who went to DC for this. Does that sound about right to everybody? We'll find out. But basically what I'm saying is that number of confidential human sources, when you step back for a moment, is not totally surprising. At first I was like, oh, interesting, a decent amount. But then, I think the frustrating thing with the narratives that have emerged from this is the core group that I think you actually need to focus on, if I were drilling down on this, is the people who enter the Capitol who are confidential human sources who didn't get charged. Those are the only ones who actually really matter, honestly. And I think there's a lot of distraction, or people have purposely created distraction from talking about these people were on the property outside, because a bunch of people were on the property outside. They're not getting charged. In fact, it was only in the very early days of the investigation that people on the lawn of the U.S. Capitol even had a remote chance of being charged. Brandon Strzok is the one that jumps out at me there, where there's someone who didn't commit any violence who was charged in the early days because he was 8 feet from the door. But nowadays, that case wouldn't have been charged, because they generally only charge people, after the first couple of months. They generally focused on people who either enter the Capitol or people who assaulted law enforcement officers outside. So I think it is a little bit of a, distraction to say that, oh, look at how many of these confidential human sources were on property, because who knows what time they arrived? Who knows if the gates were down? That's why they didn't pursue a lot of these cases. Now, if you enter the Capitol, there was an alarm going off. There was a police presence. There was a million different signs that you shouldn't have entered the Capitol. And that's why they've been able to prove those cases overwhelmingly in court. But in terms of just entering the lawn, that's a tougher one, right? Because if I went to outside of the White House right now and the gates had been opened that are normally outside of the White House and a bunch of people were inside there, I might assume that was open. So that's where those cases were tougher to bring, and why the Justice Department didn't ultimately focus on those. And the fact that they were just so wildly off on their estimations about how many people actually entered the Capitol itself in the early days of the investigation.
That was a great sort of intro, Ryan, into some of the sort of substantive pieces of the report that I think we're going to talk about. Before we turn to that, though, I want to pose one other kind of general question. Can you put sort of this report in context with other reports that the Justice Department's Inspector General has done in recent years, particularly around sort of the tone, the way it approaches the material? How does it compare to some of the other things that we have seen this particular office get itself involved in?
Well, I'd love to see the previous drafts, because I think that there was a huge editing process here at sort of the last minute. And then they had to get it through, the clearance process, right? So that was another hurdle they had to go over. So I think that they were sort of, to draw the Jack Smith metaphor, they were building this report for speed in the end, because they had, there had been a lot of time that had been wasted. My understanding is that actually most of the delay was because of not necessarily I think it impacted it, but it was not necessarily because of the Jack Smith investigation itself, but was because of the January 6th prosecutions themselves. And so once the big ones got over the line, the big ones meaning the Proud Boys seditious conspiracy case, where confidential human sources were actually an issue at play with those cases, and with the Oath Keepers case, where sort of the same thing. In fact, there was a confidential human source who knew about this ahead of time that the FBI ignored the tip on, didn't do anything with, and then testified at trial. And it turned out that he was a pedophile or a child sex offender who had sent this in at some point. So yeah, I mean, I think that was basically the reasoning for the delay. Ultimately, was just this notion that there was this massive ongoing January 6th case. But in the edit process, I think that's what sort of played out, because this was supposed to be the Jeffrey Clark report. Ultimately, this was supposed to be the report about why the inspector general was a part of a raid on Jeffrey Clark's house.
And we still don't have the answer to that question.
We still do not. There's like some coordination with Jack Smith's team, but we don't know to what extent. Was that before Jack Smith's team? I think that maybe that was Jack Smith's team already announced at that point. I forget the exact timeline of when Jeffrey Clark's home was searched, and we saw that video of him in his dress shirt and underwear. But that was, I think, what this report was originally supposed to be, is like who inside the Justice Department was assisting an attempt to overthrow the United States government was really supposed to be the focus of this report. And that's not ultimately what came out of it. Instead, what we got out of it is a report that, I'm sure you'll have a lot of, I'm fairly certain you'll have a lot of Republicans talking about, the confidential human sources thing, because that's just been an obsession for years now. And you have members talking about FBI ghost buses and busing people in, and just sorts of all these bizarre conspiracy theories. And in the end, what you end up with a report where the government dumped a bunch of resources into researching this sort of really fringe side issue without getting to the core and the heart of the matter, which was who inside the Justice Department was assisting in an effort to overthrow the 2020 election.
So shifting then to the portion of what is covered, setting aside the issue of the confidential human sources, I think the sort of remainder of what's there is really about one of the questions that I certainly have been obsessed with since the beginning, which is how in God's name did the Bureau not see this coming? And there are a lot of very complicated reasons for that, which this provides a little bit more insight into, and we can go into those. I think that I will say my sort of top line takeaway, and Molly, this goes to your point about situating it in context, is how gentle the tone of the report is. When the IG's office announced they were going to put out this report in the days after January 6th, my first thought was, oh, wow, that's really going to be a barn burner. Because anyone who has followed the oeuvre of Inspector General Michael Horowitz knows that he loves to just go in there and slash and burn and really, really criticize the department. There was a string of highly, highly critical reports coming out of the IG's office regarding the department's handling of the Clinton email investigation, of the Russia investigation, of the Comey memos, if anyone remembers those way back in the day, where the language, was pretty harsh. He took a harsh view of how the department had handled itself. And so opening this document up, I was honestly prepared for similarly stark conclusions about the Bureau's failings, particularly because, I've heard multiple former FBI officials call this, one of the worst, if not the worst, intelligence failure since 9/11, possibly worse than 9/11. And the language in the report is just not, that is not what it sounds like. There are certainly, there are criticisms made. And I think some of the evidence there is pretty damning. But the overall takeaway, it kind of ends up with, oh yeah, the FBI, they did a generally okay job. They screwed up some things, better luck next time. I'm joking a little bit, but overall it's very gentle compared to the sort of excoriating tone that the office has previously taken. And I really don't know what to make of that. I mean, maybe it's a byproduct, Ryan, of some of the sort of issues that you're flagging in terms of the strangeness of what they were doing with the Clark material, and then this issue of the confidential human sources. But I was pretty baffled, honestly, by some of the ways that the report is constructed and by some of the things it leaves out as well. I don't know. Am I being too harsh on Horowitz?
It's tough to say, because I think that what I go back to is that the January 6th committee was supposed to do a lot of this, and they made the political decision to instead focus on Trump. And so, 2020 being hindsight, although at the time I did think that was a missing component, and was wondering why that was something that wasn't focused on, because that's what the report was supposed to be about, and that's what they set out to be, and they set up a whole blue team to do that. And then in the end, the bigwigs, the people at the top of the chain, thinking Trump was this massive threat, decided that would be a distraction, that the American people couldn't walk and chew gum at the same time. And so that's what they chose to do, and sort of left these issues sitting out there, this like clear, huge intelligence failure. But yeah, I mean, the stuff with them missing the canvas, like the stuff that they did talk about, like these basic failures, I mean, it just it echoes from a report 20 years ago, right? Like, you talk about the January 6th, and then you talk about the intelligence failure, as you mentioned, like the biggest intelligence failure since September 11th, arguably larger because it was just out in there in the open, and somehow like everyone on the internet knew it, but the federal government didn't, is massive. And they didn't really drill down on that as much as I think they probably should have, because they were just like these huge systemic problems that identifies, and there was not a deep inquiry or investigation into those broader topics that could prevent this from happening in the future. I mean, some of it was just like really obvious, stuff like, hey, maybe next time we switch our procurement service, we should have some overlap, so there's not like so that you're not shutting down the tool that you have used for years on one day and then starting up with a brand new tool. Like, takes people a little bit of time
for listeners who are not familiar, is literally a thing that happened.
Like that one shouldn't have been too tough. And in fact, that was identified contemporaneously by the Washington field office. And that was more of the FBI procurement office that probably didn't think that one through, or what have you. But some of these go to a much deeper issues within the FBI, which I think, the one thing that I always go back to, and it's a quote that it's a joke that, James Comey made 10 plus years ago now, but like how people want to smoke pot in the FBI, people always say like, no, I'm being facetious or joking about it, but like literally imagine having technological skills and making the choice to make your quality of life worse. And I say that on a financial level, right? Like, you're making this huge sacrifice. If you have these technological skills, you're making a huge sacrifice to go within the FBI, because, hey, if you went into the private sector, you're going to get paid a lot more. You're going to live wherever you want in the country. And, you don't have to be forced to live somewhere you don't want to live. Other jobs might care about what your spouse does, because I think the FBI is still set up in this 1950s mentality where all that matters is your job. And, in the 1950s, it was whatever your wife was doing. It doesn't really matter if she was working at all. And nowadays, that's not the world we're living in anymore. And this idea that the FBI can just, dispatch anyone so wherever they want to in the country is not a recipe for a successful organization. And just the salary levels are not necessarily where they need to be, and just the training. It's not as though, I think that's also just a big failure that they could have gone into. There's been reports for decades now about the FBI falling behind on technological skills, but there's this huge mismatch between the Hollywood portrayal of the FBI and what people think the FBI can do, and maybe the actual reality of the FBI, which is that, there are a lot of good people there. There are a lot of hard workers there, but there's a lot of structural failures there. And there's a lot of things that do need to be changed if we're going to take on 21st century threats.
Yeah, so we've covered, I think, a couple of the sort of specific points already, but I want to dig into this question of the FBI not canvassing its field offices a little bit more extensively. So first, there's the question of sort of why didn't it do so, and what does the report tell us about that? And then there's a second question about the degree to which, for a while after January 6th, the official line was no, they had done a full canvass. And that sort of the kind of etymology of how that line makes its way first from a set of talking points and eventually into testimony, both before two Senate committees, before the January 6th committee. So maybe, Quinta, I'll come back to you first to talk a little bit about this, and then we'll go over to you, Ryan.
This is sort of the biggest failure that the report points out. So when we're talking about canvassing, what we mean is that the Washington field office failed to reach out to the field offices across the country and say, hey, can you ask your confidential human sources for information about, what might be going on January 6th, and then send that back to us. Basically a request for whatever you got on January 6th. And somewhat mystifyingly, the Bureau didn't do that. And I say mystifyingly because, as you say, Molly, one of the weird things about this whole story is that not only did the Bureau in the days after January 6th tell Congress that it had done that, but that according to this report, multiple former officials, when they were being interviewed, thought that it had done that and didn't realize that it hadn't. It was not totally clear to me if anyone at any point made the kind of affirmative decision, no, we're not going to do that. My impression, and I may be a little bit turned around here. I mean, it's difficult to figure out because this is a relatively short report describing the workings of an incredibly big and complicated bureaucracy, and we're kind of peering through a keyhole a little bit. But it seems like what happened is that the Washington field office essentially felt that they were getting too much information about material that was not 100% in scope, along the lines of, hey, there's going to be a rally on January 6th. And there's a very funny email that's reproduced here where they essentially said, why are you guys sending all this stuff to us? And so what they do is they send out this email that basically says, when you're sending us information, can you please send us more specific information about, specific threats? It seems like the people who sent the email possibly, and certainly the people above them, understood that to have been functionally the canvassing that we're talking about. But the people on the receiving end, the other field offices, did not understand it that way. And so didn't send things in, which if you read the actual email, certainly the tone is, please stop spamming us. And so there's this real disconnect that happens where the Washington field office thinks it sent this canvassing request, or some amount of people there think it sent this canvassing request. The higher ups seem to think that, but the other field offices don't think that and aren't sending things in. And so, again, I mean, Ryan, to your point about, this is a big organization. It's a little bit behind the times. Some of what you're seeing here is just, something that people who have worked in any big organization have experienced, which is that, somebody sends an email and it's not totally clear what it is that you're supposed to do, and something ends up getting dropped. What jumped out at me, I will say, and I think this is kind of a thread that I at least saw throughout the report, is there's no point at which anyone says, hey, let's not prepare for January 6th or something like that. But there's also no point where anyone says, hey, we really need to be worried about this. Like, there's no one above taking initiative and saying, okay, guys, we need to buckle down. This is a big deal. All hands on deck, right? Send out the canvassing request. And so what you get is a lot of people who are kind of like doing things like 75% of the way in the hope that the other person will sort of see what they're getting at and maybe pick up the other 25%, but not actually saying, I need you to do this. That there's this kind of, and this is me theorizing more, but unwillingness to be the person left holding the bag if, for example, the president finds out that maybe you've been looking into the activities of his supporters. So there's this there's a level where everything is kind of operating on like implication, and nobody quite wants to say it out loud. And what that does is that it means that it's very, very easy for everything to slip through the cracks because there's no one who's really cracking the whip and saying, hey, we got to get on this. Again, Ryan, I'm curious. I keep going back to you to check me on my takes, but I'm curious what you think of that.
That was a great take. 100%. Yeah, no, like that. I think that was, if I had gotten that email, I would be like, oh, clearly they don't want me to send any more. Or at the very least, I would be like, well, this is an additional burden. I'm not going to do this unless it's like really super serious. And even then it'll be, like if you impose an additional bureaucratic hurdle on people, they're not going to do that. What we are supposed to learn from the 9/11 report was that information sharing is key. And, everyone should be having the same info because you can make connections that you can't. I mean, that's really ultimately why the sleuths have been so much more successful than the FBI at identifying people, because the FBI, the way it is structurally set up, is not built for the internet era. It's not built for easy information sharing across, there are all these various little fiefdoms, different parts of the country work very much so differently. There's not just the ease of sharing that there should be. And there's not, easy communication tools. And the other thing is that every utterance is being permanently recorded forever. And so you can't have these like honest discussions because, they can do their red cell efforts and write it in really bureaucratic, boring language that that doesn't make it compelling to read. But if you were to look at this honestly, what they're doing is they're focusing all of these individual trees and creating a bunch of bureaucratic hurdles and just creating a bunch of make work that's not going to actually have any benefit, when the actual threat was clearly the fact that millions of people thought that the election was stolen. Thousands of them were coming to DC, and the rhetoric around it was crazy. That's the threat there. It's not picking off this one individual actor. Did they cross this threshold of whatever sort of thing behind the scenes? And this is all an effort of starting to set up a forthcoming discussion about the First Amendment considerations there.
So we'll get to that in a second when we get to the part of the conversation where we cover some more stuff that's not in the report. I do want to touch on one other thing that is in the report. So far we've talked about the degree to which the FBI did not canvass its field offices. Ryan gave us a great overview of the report's discussion of confidential human sources and the degree to which it sort of rebuts a set of conspiracy theories about that. The other thing I want to talk about, and again, maybe I'll go to Quinta first on this because I know this is the thing that's been another bee that's been in her bonnet for a while, which is this question of confusion among a set of federal agencies, principally DOJ and the Department of Defense, about who was the lead federal agency on January 6th, and then a set of operational decisions that flowed from that. So, Quinta, can you just sort of, again, for listeners, give us a sense of what's the problem here? And do we learn anything about the problem from this report?
So I believe that we first learned about this actually from a report from, I forget which Senate committee. It might have been the Senate Rules Committee or Senate HISCAC.
They did an investigation together because sometimes Senate committees are capable of playing well with each other in a way the House committees are just not. But that's a topic for another day.
Thank you to the Senate. Yeah, so there was an investigation that came out of those committees that basically said part of the problem was that no one was quite certain which agency was in charge of preparing for January 6th. And one of the things that report said that has been kind of mystifying is that basically everybody else said that DOJ had been designated as what is called the lead federal agency in charge of preparing, except that DOJ, when they were asked, said, no, we weren't. And this has always been kind of puzzling. I think this report honestly does not offer a huge amount of clarity on that matter, although it does provide a little more detail that essentially there is a specific conference call between the Defense Department, the Justice Department, and I believe DHS and the Interior Department are also on it, where the Defense Department essentially says, okay, we need a lead federal agency. We understand that the White House has designated DOJ as the lead agency that's going to be in charge of all of this coordination. And then the report says, however, DOD and DOJ officials were not in agreement as to whether DOJ had agreed. And it quotes Jeffrey Rosen, who I believe at that time was the acting attorney general, essentially saying, yes, Milley said that, but I never agreed that I was going to do it. And it really seems like for whatever reason, there was just a profound breakdown of communication here where, this isn't like the smoking gun that allowed January 6th to happen. But I do think it's just another one of these things where you see how there are all of these little areas, like with, the inability to get the National Guard on the scene for hours, where communication kind of breaks down. It's not totally clear who's driving the bus. And I think this report provides more detail there, but it doesn't, to me, at least satisfactorily answer that question of why did this happen? Although it does it is perhaps another data point in sort of the story that I'm trying to tell here of like, no one wants to be the one left holding the bag.
So we've talked a fair amount about what is in the report. Let's talk a little bit about what's not in the report. Two things I want to touch on here. And first, Ryan, I'm going to come back to you on something you mentioned earlier. At one point, you described this report as this was supposed to be the Jeff Clark report. So can we talk a little more about what's not in this report in terms of what was actually unfolding at the Department of Justice in the days up to January 6th and then, on the day itself?
Yeah, and this was something that I kind of didn't occur to me until I myself tried putting back together the timeline of what was happening in those days in the lead up to January 6th. And it's relevant to what we were talking about before, DOJ not realizing they were in this lead role, because there was something else happening within the Justice Department that might have been slightly distracting in a couple of days before January 6th. And it was literally not until I sat down and put this together for shameless plug, my book Sedition Hunters, that I recognized what was happening, right? And I was like, oh, okay, so this event happened on a Wednesday. And over that weekend was that crazy moment where Jeffrey Clark was even on the calendar at the White House at some point as the acting attorney general, that this was all in motion, this was happening. And there was this incredible meeting at the White House, which I believe was on the Sunday night, where it was basically a bunch of people that Donald Trump had appointed to be Justice Department officials saying that they would quit rather than work under Jeffrey Clark, who, thought there was the potential that the election was stolen via smart thermostat, or at least wanted to explore that question. And, I would say subsequently also didn't realize, that on Twitter, when he used to start a tweet with an @, that it wouldn't get as much traction as before, just to set the level on his level of technological sophistication. That's what the situation that it was in. This was someone who was an environmental lawyer who was clearly susceptible, as millions of Americans were, to these lies about the election. And he was someone who was willing to do what the president wanted at that point, and that's who the president wanted to put in charge. And that could have been, if that night had gone just slightly differently, like a Watergate type moment, right? Where that could have, instead of the Friday night massacre, it would have been the Sunday night massacre, where there was literally a letter written about how Jeffrey Rosen, which I didn't read until years later, it was a resignation letter for Jeffrey Rosen and a bunch of other people. And you could tell it was written for history, a little bit, it was just this is my moment for the people. I'm going to take my stand and do what I want. But, it wasn't that tough of a decision, I don't think, at that point for folks to make, because literally you're deciding hey, is the market going to reward someone who tries to overturn the election? Or, the way I sort of describe it in the book is that the morally correct decision was also the financially advantageous decision. They aligned perfectly at that point, because you're giving up 2 weeks of a paycheck and to go down in history as this hero, right? So it wasn't even that easy. That wasn't even that tough of a moral call. But nonetheless, that's what was happening inside the Justice Department. So it's easy to figure out why they might have been distracted. And, when they're literally on the phone call for planning purposes, and at that same time, then Jeffrey Clark is hey, let's go meet upstairs, and somebody's packing their office. And, the deputy attorney general is literally taking stuff off of his walls because he thinks that, that he's going to be, marched out of the Justice Department building by somebody from the White House. So that's the sort of chaos that was happening behind the scenes in the days before January 6th. And, then you get that email late at night on a Sunday. I'm guessing there's a little bit of catch up to do on that Monday. So that brings us to the 4th, and then the 5th, and then there we are on the 6th, right? So there just wasn't a lot of time for anybody to make sure that all the I's were dotted and the T's were crossed in lead up to January 6th because of this internal crisis at the Justice Department. That's what wasn't in the report.
So, Quinta, now I want to ask about something that wasn't in the report, about which I know you have thoughts, which is a robust discussion of claims made by a number of high-ranking FBI officials about the Bureau's inability to review publicly available social media information as part of their investigation. Talk to us about sort of that issue and what is not addressed in this report.
This goes back to something that Ryan was saying earlier about, one of the things that makes this an intelligence failure on the FBI's part is that everyone knew it was going to happen. I mean, we didn't all know that rioters were going to break into the Capitol, but we knew that something was going to happen on January 6th because everyone was posting about it and Trump had tweeted about it. And so when FBI Director Christopher Wray is kind of hauled in front of Congress in the weeks and months after the 6th, one of the things he says is, well, you have to understand we're limited in our ability to look at and sort of save for future reference public social media posts because of First Amendment restrictions. I have a very long, very dense Lawfare article spelling out why I think this is arguably inconsistent. Not arguably, it is inconsistent with a pretty clear guidance that is set out in FBI guidelines, what's known as the DIOG. I forget what the acronym precisely stands for. The short version is that Wray seemed to present to Congress a level of difficulty that is just functionally not actually there when it comes to the FBI's ability to look at, online posts that are publicly available because of First Amendment restrictions. You would think that would be relevant to the intelligence failures that this report is going into, but it doesn't really feature at all. It kind of shows up here and there where there are references to, the Bureau reminding people about First Amendment restrictions, right? Concerns about getting tips that didn't speak to violence because this is First Amendment protected activity, that kind of thing. But it's not addressed head on. And, okay, fine, like we all have different priorities, but it did strike me as odd because no one, as far as I know, has really done a deep dive into, was Wray's understanding the understanding of the Bureau guidelines that was communicated to people within the agency? Because if so, that seems like a potential problem when we now have, this is an agency that's continuing to be responsible for responding to, potential domestic terror. It would seem relevant to me to look into how the Bureau is interpreting its own guidelines, how it understands its own authorities and the relationship between its authorities and the First Amendment, especially, in an environment increasingly shaped by social media. But we really we've never gotten an answer there. Congress has not really been interested. I was hoping that the IG would be interested, and they don't seem to have been either. I found this particularly odd, I will say, because of one particular note. So one of the examples, I think, of the kind of zeroing in on the trees and completely missing the forest that you mentioned, Ryan, is this obsession with making sure that the Bureau was tracking domestic terror suspects who were going to DC. They get very, very invested in making sure that they have eyes on all these people traveling to DC, which makes sense, certainly, if you're concerned about potential violence. But the way it's set out in the report, it seems like there's a sort of very narrow focus on that to the exclusion of basically all other intelligence activity around January 6th at that time. And this jumped out at me because the argument that Wray was making in front of Congress is essentially, look, we can't, look at tweets because of First Amendment restrictions where we need to have an open investigation in order to have the authority to look at those tweets, and we can't do anything if we don't have an investigation. Now, bracket that. I think there's a very good reason to think that that's actually not true. But even accepting that Wray's presentation is correct there, then there's this question of, okay, there weren't any open investigations that could have provided you with a hook to look on Twitter. And this had always seemed odd because Wray said when he goes in front of Congress, he says, we have over 1,000 open domestic terror investigations. Again, not one of them allowed you that hook. Okay, fine. I think it gets even weirder with this report because now we know not only were there, I think he said 1,400 open domestic terrorism investigations, we now know that some portion of the subjects of those investigations were traveling to the Capitol on January 6th, and that the Bureau was aware of this because they were tracking them. So in none of those instances, there was enough to provide any kind of a hook to look on Twitter, look on Parler, look on Gab, none, zero, really? And again, there are a lot of questions here, right? I don't know how much of a hook you need, right? Can you only look at like one Parler post if you have a hook? Can you look at the whole chain of comments? I think there are real questions here. But to me, it makes the argument that the Bureau lacked these authorities even harder to believe, given that clearly there were open domestic terrorism investigations that were relevant to what was happening on January 6th. That's my rant.
Yes. Very good rant. Yes. I think also you got to look at like the history of what has happened to people who spoke honestly about their feelings about the threat that Donald Trump posed within the FBI. Like you look at, when we were doing the Crossfire Hurricane IG report, you look back to that one and like people sent like, a little message that for some reason they didn't recognize was being like permanently stored by the FBI, but they were sort of had like, jokes or made casual water cooler talk over an FBI platform. And then suddenly they're getting hauled before the inspector general because they made like some like, and that wasn't because that actually influenced the way that they do their job. People have the ability to separate their personal opinions or their snark or their, sort of their little rants from the way that they do their job. That's something that you are able to do and separate and recognize that here's how the law applies. But it's the appearance of impropriety is what they really focused on in that report. And I think that that's something people have been sort of running scared of ever since. And the thought process was, oh my gosh, you got to the end of the Trump era. Here we are. We're almost on the, if you're within the FBI, first time around, you're like, okay, we got to the end of it. Sure, he's saying a bunch of crazy stuff, but like, am I going to stick my neck out at the very end here and like talk honestly about the implications of what that could mean when, okay, all the signs are pointing towards that, we're going to have an inauguration and this isn't something I'm going to have to be worried about. But also probably the House Republicans are going to be super interested in this down the line. Yeah, I mean, I think that people made decisions based upon the world they were living in. And also just, I always go back to the vacation thing, but it's a real thing because I think like 2020 was this awful year, right? Like everybody desperately needed that break. And one thing that I had completely and totally forgotten about until I went back into the timeline was that there was a bombing in Nashville on Christmas Day, right? And the FBI surged all these resources to it because that's what they do. They're good at these things. But so it wasn't as though people were taking 2 weeks straight off. It was a bunch of people from a bunch of field offices flooded the zone. Everybody was working this bombing during the holidays and interrupting time with their family, right, for this purpose, right? So if you're someone who gets assigned to that purpose and that's a domestic terrorism case, and then you're coming back, it's like, okay, yeah, let me take a few days off in early January instead. And like just the logistical hurdles that you have to deal with around the holiday. And that was honestly for me, the first thing that I thought of when I saw this, like what happened in New Orleans and what happened in Las Vegas on New Year's Day is that was during the most vulnerable period. Now, of course, we should say we don't know that there was any FBI failure there yet, but it would not totally and completely surprise me were we to learn down the line that the FBI had at some point received tips about either of those individuals.
While we're on the topic of the FBI, I do want us to talk a little bit about another document that was released recently in the January 6th investigation space, which was a report from the Committee on House Administration, sort of group led by Barry Loudermilk, member of Congress. Loudermilk has been leading basically a House investigation into the investigators, as has been referred to, an investigation of the House's January 6th investigation for the past 2 years. I think I saw Kyle Cheney point out this morning that they have been investigating the investigation longer than the investigation itself happened. But just before Christmas, Loudermilk's panel put out a report on the investigation that sort of teased the existence of a second document, which came out more recently, specifically on the FBI's failure to identify who planted the pipe bombs outside the Republican National Committee and the Democratic National Committee on January 6th. I want to sort of talk about this other particular FBI failure in a second, but Quinta, can you first give us a little more context than I just did? Like, how should we think about what Loudermilk has been up to? How do we situate this like investigation of the investigators in the broader discourse about Congress? Congress's efforts, the government's efforts more broadly to hold people accountable for what happened on January 6th?
It's a great question, and I wish I knew the answer, honestly. This has been a very odd little investigation. So I think the pipe bomb report is technically the third report. There was an initial report, then there was a second one that came out, I believe, late this fall or early this December. And now we have this pipe bomb document. And certainly the overall posture is, investigating the investigators. There's a real tone in the first two reports of basically sort of trying to make the argument that the committee is illegitimate. There's a lot of complaints about how Liz Cheney wasn't a real vice chair. There's some complaints about the committee allegedly deleting a bunch of material.
Yeah, and these are particularly the parts about the committee not being properly constituted will be really familiar to anyone who, for their sins, spent any time reading any of the court filings in any of the cases that challenged the January 6th committee's subpoena authority. That part of it is sort of well-trodden ground for the objections that Republicans had to what that committee did.
Right. Well, so, and part of that has been this release of videotapes from the Capitol on January 6th, which, Ryan, I'm curious for your thoughts of to what extent that has achieved what House Republicans might have thought it would achieve versus provide more fuel for investigating, for sort of public open source investigations. So that's one thing. But then what's interesting, I thought, in the pipe bomb report is that there actually is like a fair amount of substantive information in here about a portion of the January 6th story that has always been a mystery. They still have not caught the pipe bomber. And it appears that the FBI maybe interpreted this as a little prod in the back, because the day after the report came out, the Bureau released more information about the bomber and say, actually, we have this person's height and shoe size. Please help us find them. So we do, thanks to Loudermilk, have a much fuller picture of where things stand in terms of the bomber. And it seems to have really pushed the Bureau a little bit on an issue where, as we were mentioning earlier, the January 6th committee kind of decided not to bring its focus. So there's sort of a strange mix of feeding red meat to the base and actually producing valuable information, although perhaps not valuable in the way that followers of Donald Trump might have anticipated or wanted.
I loved the surprised tone in your voice upon stating that there was valuable information in a report that came out of Barry Loudermilk's committee. I was surprised too, I will say. There was substantive information in that report, and that's not to disparage in any way the work that they've done on Mr. Coffee Guy, who is the individual that they have said that the FBI should have investigated for setting up the gallows outside of the Capitol on January 6th. They've done that investigation. It was based off of sort of a right-wing thing about, well, what's the FBI doing about this? Did that report mention, for example, that there's no core criminal offense for setting up a political prop, that's not inside of the Capitol, that there's not an actual criminal statute that would in any way apply to that sort of behavior, or that they haven't focused on just general people who were far away from the Capitol? No, of course it didn't, right? But it did gin up a lot of articles. And that's a lot of what I think these reports have been formatted to do, is just to generate attention and fuel conspiracy theories. And that's what they've done. It's a little bit of like a flood the zone type of strategy that I think that they're ultimately using here. And that sort of ties into the footage, because, one of the things the sleuths have really been bothered by, because they're some of the only people who have bothered to look at the thousands of hours of boring, mostly surveillance footage that the House Republicans have produced, is that they've missed all of the key moments, right? Like, for whatever reason, I don't know their intent, but what I do know is that the product that they have put out is all of the most boring footage from January 6th that has no actual relevance. And any of the violent scenes they have a few of them in there. I don't know if that was, they escaped and got through by accident. I don't know their intention, but what I can tell you is that the footage that would have been the most compelling is not the footage that they have released. And instead what they've happened is dumped a bunch of footage on there that then people on Twitter have then dissected, not knowing anything about, and then posted memes about. And then members of Congress, including Mike Lee, have then reposted that. And we've all wasted a bunch of time and energy and go on, money, what have you, talking about complete and utter garbage nonsense that just doesn't make any logical sense whatsoever. And that's what has happened. So as a result of this, they've put out things and it's like, oh, is this person flashing a badge? No, that's a vape pen, actually. And that person's sitting in jail for sort of 6 years now, but thanks for your time and service. Like that's what we've been working on for there's just been so much wasted time on conspiracy theories. And it's just kind of astonishing that this is where we're at, because there's not like a shared reality in America. Instead, we talk about nonsense from people who don't understand things on the internet. So that's my short version.
No, I think it's a really important point. And, when I think about the degree to which we've learned anything from these hours and hours of security footage, I think that for me, the one important new thing was uncovered by Capitol Hill journalist Jamie Dupree, who tracked down sort of the path that the fake electors took, the fake elector paperwork took from Mike Kelly's office to an attempt to be delivered to the Senate parliamentarian. And that's a consequential thing that we now know more about, but it's one thing out of all of that footage. I want to ask one kind of higher level question before we wrap, which is about sort of how should we think about the value of different kinds of investigations. And so we have this Inspector General report, and we talked about this, that the Inspector General kind of didn't do, or at least didn't publicize certain parts of their investigation because of the way that it interacted with the criminal investigation. People left government, then did not have to be responsive to the IG in the way that they would have had to be if they were still in government. In some ways, that's an argument for having a congressional investigation, but we also see the promises and pitfalls of congressional investigations. And so, Quinta, maybe I'll start with you and then go to Ryan and just ask for your kind of concluding thoughts on, as we sort of approach the 4th anniversary of January 6th, as we kind of move out of this period of active criminal prosecution, that sort of thing. Like, how do you take stock of the various tools that Congress and the government more broadly have used to try and investigate what happened?
I don't know. I think that the January 6th committee, I will say, I think comes out looking the best in terms of, understanding the challenge for what it was, and also understanding, Ryan, to your previous point, the need to do something new to communicate in a really fractured media environment in terms of the, primetime broadcasts, sort of rethinking the format of a congressional committee investigation. At the same time, as you also point out, Molly, there are limits, unfortunately, given the current state of the jurisprudence on Congress's ability to force compliance with subpoenas. And the committee made choices based on its assessment of sort of the political realities and of the time crunch that I think really limited its ability to really dig into some of these major issues like the pipe bomb, like the First Amendment concerns. I do worry that we've kind of ended up in a situation where everyone feels like everyone else did the part that needs to be done. And you sort of see this very literally at the beginning of the IG report, where they basically say, oh, well, there was a criminal investigation, so we didn't do this. Oh, well, these other, inspectors general did this investigation, so we didn't do that. And, look, if in a month there's, Jack Smith releases a final report as provided for under the special counsel guidelines, and that has further information or like criminal referrals or something like that, and then the DOJ IG's office picks things up again and starts looking back into it, then I will feel very differently. But I do now feel like if you look at that and then you look at kind of other congressional committees, maybe turning to what the January 6th committee did and saying, okay, great, they did January 6th now. We don't need to look into, the Judiciary Committee doesn't need to dig into what happened more at the FBI. We don't need the intelligence communities to dig into the intelligence failures here. That there's a desire to kind of like move on that is maybe not helpful. Whereas if there had been more of an understanding that what the January 6th committee was doing was one piece of a much, much, much bigger puzzle, that would have been a healthier outcome. I realize what I'm asking is for all different parts of the political and governmental machine to be singularly focused on investigating January 6th, which may be a bit too much to ask.
Before we hear from Ryan, I'll just say to listeners that Quinta wrote a really great piece making a more robust version of the argument that she just made and published it the day before Election Day. So it got sort of lost in the great shuffle of the first week of November 2024. But I would encourage you all to check it out. Ryan, over to you.
Yeah, well, Quinta stole my points about the media environment, and made them much more articulately than I would have. So now I have to come up with a secondary answer. But yeah, I mean, I do think that was a big thing. Is like, I think Daniel Jones, who wrote the torture report, basically, or helped write the torture report, has spoken about this too. Like, the torture report that the Senate put together, it was something that everybody had on their shelves, but nobody read. And Americans don't read a lot. So that's the fundamental core problem. So banging people over the head with information in the simplest, quickest way possible is really important. And I've made the joke before that, the Inspector General really needs to get into TikTok and just start, making these videos to get things to get things to break through to the public, sort of jokingly. But I think that, getting information across in the most compelling way possible and making it in the simplest form possible that people can understand very quickly without reading a dense report is really essential. And that's somewhat of a media problem and a government problem, because, people are very busy. People are very tied up in their own lives and have limited time to absorb information. And they're getting so much incoming information that it can just be way too much for them to absorb. But yeah, I don't know what happens in the future in terms of the Inspector General reports. But I will say, we're going into a time when there could be some of the same issues that were supposed to be examined in terms of Jeffrey Clark's behavior. Once again, that's what we're walking into. We're walking into an administration where the incoming president has made very clear that he wants people to act in a certain way and has made clear that he has enemies that he wants them to go after. I wish that report was out. I wish that would have served its value to the public in examining these issues and making those bounds and those lines crystal clear about where people within the Justice Department, what they were required to do under the oath that they took to uphold the U.S. Constitution.
All right, Ryan, Quinta, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you both.
The Lawfare podcast is produced in cooperation with the Brookings Institution. You can get ad-free versions of this and other Lawfare podcasts by becoming a Lawfare material supporter through our website, lawfaremedia.org/support. You'll also get access to special events and other content available only to our supporters. Please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. Look out for our other podcasts, including Rational Security, Chatter, Allies, and The Aftermath, our latest Lawfare Presents podcast series on the government's response to January 6th. Check out our written work at lawfaremedia.org. The podcast is edited by Jen Patier, and your audio engineer this episode was Kara Schillen of Go Rodeo. Our theme song is from Alibad Yusuf. As always, thank you for listening.